Cunningham.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm pleased to be able to respond to the statement provided to the House by the Health Minister and the Shadow Health Minister when we last met on what has been an extraordinary challenge to all of us through this pandemic situation. Just to update the House from the Illawarra Shoalhaven Local Health District, numbers released this morning. And there have been a total of 117 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the region. Currently, thank heavens, there's none who are hospitalised. There are 115 who have recovered, and the total number of people tested has been 25,152. So I commend all of our health services, from the Health Minister and the Shadow Health Minister, who made statements right through all of the authorities and the service providers that have been involved in that outcome. There is no doubt that a number of months ago we were all very, very concerned that we would see very different numbers to those, not only in my own region but across the country, as we saw evolving internationally the impacts that this pandemic was having in other countries. When we did last meet, I had a brief 90-second opportunity to thank many of the amazing locals who had been working day in and day out to support our community at this time, and I acknowledge the doctors and nurses and medical staff, educators right across the board, early education, schools, TAFE, our universities, retail workers. Of course, many shops were shut, but then many others were under enormous pressure, as we saw from panic buying, but also just in general remaining open and dealing with all the need to keep their shops safe while they were providing essential goods to people. Cleaners, cleaners across workplaces and public transport and all of those places, quietly going about their job, ensuring that we were safe. Transport workers still happen to be out on the road, making sure deliveries got through, and particularly as more and more people relied on things being delivered to the home as they self-isolated. Mental health workers, homeless service workers, disability care. As my colleague, the member for Macarthur, said, these times hit those who are the most vulnerable the hardest, and they are in an even greater need for the services that those workers provide. And the same for family and domestic violence workers. Sadly, we know that there is much more pressure on those services at such a time. Our public servants, the obvious frontline public service workers such as our police and emergency service workers, but also people like those who work in our embassies and foreign affairs, who we would all know were putting in extraordinary hours as they interacted with our officers and our staff and the general public, as people were trapped overseas and or trapped here trying to get home, all of those circumstances. The public servants have had to roll out government programs that were announced, with very short lead times, obviously, and yet had to get out there and make sure that those services under those new programs were delivered. An extraordinary effort. I want to also acknowledge union representatives, many in my area, who had to immediately start to help people work out what the situation was as work conditions changed, the JobKeeper program, how would that operate, and make sure that things were actually facilitated, as we saw at the top level between the Minister and the ACTU, at the local level, that we could all work together to make sure these things operated well. And I want to acknowledge those representatives, as well as other organisations in our area that worked in that space. And I particularly think of the Illawarra Business Chamber, who did a lot of work getting information out to their members about how those programs would operate. I do want to report to the House a particular incident. We had the Ruby Princess docked at Port Kembla in my electorate. Of course, it is still at the centre of some significant questions under current investigations. Given the deep concerns of many in our community about the pandemic at the time, when the state government decided to direct the ship to Port Kembla, it would not have been surprising if people had expressed anger at this. Quite rightly, our local community were concerned and deeply sceptical about the decision. Despite that, they rallied in common human concern for the crew who were still aboard that ship. Messages of support were sent to them, friendship packages were sourced, packed and supplied to the crew, and myself, along with my colleagues, the state members for Wollongong and Kira, supported by my federal colleague member for Whitlam and my state colleague, the member for Shellharbour, all worked together to get those packages to the crew. I want to particularly acknowledge John Kua, who leads the amazing team at our local mission to seafarers, who work tirelessly to provide support to the seafarers in our port. Nicole Dillon and family, they suggested the idea of reaching out to the crew and encouraging community participation. Peter Ernst, GM Port Authority New South Wales, for his excellent role in liaising between New South Wales Police, New South Wales Health, Princess Cruises Australia, and ultimately to get clearance for the delivery of the friendship care packages. Mark Slay, who's the CEO of Destination Illawarra, for his brilliant ability to make sure we had extensive media coverage, especially in sharing good news stories to the wider community and the world in a time when communities were gripped with fear and uncertainty. And Richard Moore for his support, and especially for the lovely postcards which people were able to sign, and they were laminated and delivered prior to the Ruby's departure. And we will never forget the scene of that huge cruise ship sailing out of Port Kembla with one of our local tugs giving it a farewell with the hoses, and they put a huge sign on the back saying "Thank you, Illawarra," and it just shows I think the great humanity that sometimes we see. And may we see more of it during such difficult times. So the packing and care packages, I want to just acknowledge these people: Jill Crosley, Nicole Dillon and family, Paul Scully MP and Alison Burns Scully, Ryan Park MP, Susan Wallace, David Boscanet, Louise Del Rio, Stephen Crinks, Colin and Annette Booth, Lima Kua and family, Paul Lowmaker, Kylie Martin and Llewellyn Hinder, and many others whose names I don't have, who gave up their long weekend at Easter to assist in that mammoth task. And of course, we were joined by an organisation called Good 360 Australia. It was an extraordinary contribution by them, $70,000 worth of goods that they sourced. Thank you to Alison Covington, the founder and managing director of Good 360, and her team. And also the Port Authority New South Wales, because as you can imagine, with that much of a contribution, it was a huge effort to pack those onto the crates that need to go onto ships to be delivered, and they helped with that. And we also acknowledge and thank the Australian Mariners Welfare Society for contributing $12,000 towards the project, and our sincere thanks to the Mission to Seafarers Sydney for contributing $500. Also, I want to acknowledge Colaris and Company, who helped us with transporting the goods to the ship. There were obviously many stories of people doing important things at the time. I just want to, in the time that's left to me, indicate to the House I'll be looking for some other opportunities to talk about how the government's initiatives that I've outlined, in particular JobKeeper, are working in our area, because there are some concerns, and I genuinely welcome the JobKeeper program. I think it's a good initiative, but there are some anomalies that are causing real concern, and I really ask the government to listen and take on board. The Treasurer has the power under the legislation to sign off and make changes, and for me, the Donata workers who work at our airports are a particular case. I have a number of them in my electorate, live in my electorate, work at Sydney Airport, and some of them have contacted me. Basically, you know, they've worked in this job for many years, and beyond their power, the ownership has gone from an Australian ownership to a foreign ownership. Yet they've continued doing the same job, in ensuring that our aircraft are supplied and food is provided and all the things that all of us enjoy as we travel, not so much recently. But those workers, because of that ownership, have been locked out of accessing the JobKeeper, and many of them are not eligible for JobSeeker either, and that's the case in my constituents. So I asked the government to have another look at that, because these workers do need that support.
Order. The honourable member's time has expired.